April 11th, 1945, 15:15 hours. Buchenwald concentration camp, Weimar, Germany. Private First Class Harry Herder of the 6th Armored Division had fought across France and into Germany, had seen burned villages and shattered cities, had witnessed the machinery of modern war in all its industrial brutality. But nothing in 2 years of combat had prepared him for the smell that hit his patrol 300 yards from the camp perimeter. A stench of death so overwhelming that men who'd walked past bloated corpses on battlefields bent over retching. Through the spring mist, skeletal figures pressed against electrified fence wire, staring at American tanks with eyes that held no hope. Only the dull patience of people who'd stopped expecting anything except death. They wore striped uniforms that hung from bones like cloth draped over coat racks. Some were too weak to stand and watched from where they'd collapsed in the mud. Herder's squad leader, Sergeant Michael Kahn, raised his binoculars and went absolutely still. When he lowered them, his hands were shaking. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "they're still alive." For the 21,000 prisoners still breathing behind Buchenwald's wire, and tens of thousands more in camps across collapsing Germany, liberation by American forces came not as expected rescue, but as incomprehensible miracle. They had stopped believing in salvation. They had stopped believing in anything except the next day's survival and the mercy of death. And then men with rifles and strange accents appeared, broke the locks, and spoke words no prisoner thought they'd ever hear. "You're free." The secret architecture of death. The Nazi concentration camp system had existed in Germany since 1933, expanding across 12 years into an industrial mechanism for processing human beings toward destruction. By April 1945, as American forces drove east through fragmenting German resistance, approximately 700,000 prisoners remained alive in camps throughout the territories the Third Reich had once controlled. The mathematics of the camp system defied human comprehension. Total concentration camps in Nazi system. Over 1,000 main camps and subcamps. Prisoners in camps at peak, 1944. Approximately 715,000. Prisoners liberated by American forces, approximately 250,000. Dead on liberation, estimated 20,000, 30,000 in camps Americans reached. Average prisoner weight at Buchenwald liberation, 75 or 85 pounds for adult males. Daily caloric intake in final months, 700, 900 calories. Disease mortality rate in final weeks, approximately 300, 500 deaths per day at major camps. American military intelligence had received reports about camps. Classified documents mentioned detention facilities, forced labor sites, prisoner deaths. But intelligence reports conveyed information without comprehension. They described facts without capturing the systematic destruction of humanity that facts alone could not communicate. The camps existed in a landscape of willful blindness. German civilians in nearby towns claimed ignorance despite smoke from crematoria visible for miles, despite thousands of prisoners marching through streets, despite the smell that permeated everything downwind. The camps were secrets everyone knew, but no one acknowledged. The approach through hell. As American forces advanced through Bavaria and Thuringia in early April 1945, forward units began encountering evidence of something beyond military installations or industrial sites. Refugees whispered about camps where people went in but didn't come out. Reconnaissance flights photographed compounds with suspicious layouts. Long barracks, guard towers, facilities whose purpose wasn't immediately clear from aerial photos. The 4th Armored Division approaching Ohrdruf on April 4th encountered their first direct evidence. A small camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, had been partially evacuated days earlier. What remained shocked soldiers who thought they'd become hardened to war's horrors. Captain Alvin Barber, whose company was first through Ohrdruf's gates, documented the scene in his after-action report. Found approximately 3,200 corpses in various states of decomposition. Evidence of systematic murder. Bodies showed signs of execution, starvation, beating. Living prisoners numbered fewer than 200, all in critical condition. Several died during our initial hours on site, despite immediate medical intervention. Recommend urgent headquarters notification of findings that exceed standard war crimes parameters. The Ohrdruf discoveries triggered immediate command attention. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited the camp on April 12th with Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. Eisenhower ordered comprehensive documentation and mandated that nearby German civilians be brought to witness what had existed in their proximity. Patton, a combat veteran known for his hard demeanor, vomited behind a barracks. Bradley stared in silence. Eisenhower walked through the entire camp methodically, refusing to turn away from any horror, then issued orders. Get it all on record. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will deny this happened. The gates of Buchenwald. 7 days after Ohrdruf, elements of the 6th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division approached Buchenwald, one of the Nazi system's oldest and largest camps. Intelligence estimated 10,000 prisoners. The actual number exceeded 21,000, packed into facilities designed for a fraction of that population. The camp's resistance organization, prisoners who'd maintained clandestine communication networks and hidden weapons salvaged from forced labor in nearby armaments factories, had prevented SS guards from executing all prisoners before American arrival. As guards fled on April 11th, resistance members seized control of watchtowers and prevented the final massacre that SS standing orders had mandated. When American tanks reached the perimeter that afternoon, they found prisoners controlling the camp but unable to escape. The electrified fences still carried current. The gates remained locked, and prisoners were too weak to break free even with guards gone. Lieutenant Edward Tenenbaum, a German-speaking intelligence officer, approached the main gate cautiously, uncertain whether armed prisoners represented threat or victims. Through the wire, thousands of faces stared at American uniforms with expressions Tenenbaum struggled to interpret. Not joy, not relief, but something closer to disbelief. I called out in German that we were American Army, that they were safe, that we were opening the camp, Tenenbaum recalled decades later. There was no reaction, complete silence. I think they thought they were hallucinating, that starvation had finally broken their minds. When tanks broke the locks and the gates swung open, people just stood there. They'd stopped believing in open gates. The first hours of freedom. The initial hours after liberation created chaos that threatened to kill prisoners who'd survived years of systematic destruction. Men who could barely stand tried to walk through gates. Those who'd been starved to skeletal condition attempted to eat whatever they could find. Some prisoners attacked German guards who'd been captured by advancing American forces, while others simply collapsed once the tension of survival broke. American personnel responding to Buchenwald faced medical and humanitarian challenges that exceeded any training or experience. Combat medics trained to treat bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries confronted thousands of patients dying from starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and diseases that resulted from years of malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Staff Sergeant Marcus Klein, a medic with the 89th Infantry Division, described the medical triage. We had maybe 30 medics for 21,000 prisoners. Thousands needed immediate hospitalization. We had to decide who might survive treatment and who was too far gone. I was 22 years old, making life and death decisions every 5 minutes. Some men I gave water to died while drinking it. Their systems were too damaged to process even basic hydration. The challenge of feeding starved prisoners proved immediately lethal. Well-meaning soldiers shared their rations, not understanding that stomachs shrunken by months of starvation couldn't process normal food quantities. Rich American military rations, canned meat, chocolate, dense crackers, killed prisoners whose digestive systems had adapted to near-starvation rations. After dozens died from refeeding syndrome in Buchenwald's first hours of liberation, medical officers established strict protocols. Nothing but thin soup and small bread portions for the first days, with quantities increasing slowly as digestive systems recovered. The discipline of denying food to starving people strained every instinct of soldiers who wanted to help. The prisoners' disbelief. For prisoners who'd survived months or years expecting nothing except continued suffering, terminated by death. Liberation created psychological disorientation as profound as physical rescue. The sudden arrival of American forces, the opening of gates, the provision of food and medical care, all contradicted the reality they'd internalized as permanent and inescapable. The psychological adaptation required by liberation manifested in various ways. Some prisoners wept uncontrollably. Others remained silent, unable to process the transformation. Many refused to believe freedom was real for days after liberation, fearing it was elaborate deception that would end in renewed imprisonment or execution. Israel Gutman, a Jewish prisoner who'd survived Buchenwald since transfer from Auschwitz, described his initial response to American arrival. When I saw soldiers in different uniforms cutting the wire, my first thought was that these were new guards with new methods of torment. We'd learned that hope was dangerous. It made suffering worse. When an American medic touched my shoulder gently and called me, "Sir," I didn't understand. Guards didn't call us sir. Guards didn't touch us gently. I thought my mind had finally broken. The cultural gaps between American liberators and international prisoner populations created communication challenges that sometimes overshadowed immediate rescue. Prisoners spoke dozens of languages: Polish, Russian, French, Hungarian, Yiddish, German, Czech. American personnel spoke mostly English with some German. Simple questions about names, nationalities, or medical needs required elaborate interpretation chains. The diversity of prisoner populations shocked American personnel, who'd anticipated finding primarily German political prisoners. Buchenwald held resistance fighters from France, Soviet POWs, Polish intellectuals, Hungarian Jews, Czech partisans, Romani people, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, common criminals, and dozens of other groups swept up by Nazi persecution machinery. The work of mercy. In the days following liberation, American forces transformed from combat units into humanitarian organizations with no preparation for the role. Combat soldiers became nurses, cooks, administrators, and counselors. The work of mercy proved more psychologically challenging than combat operations many veterans had endured. The 120th Evacuation Hospital arrived at Buchenwald 48 hours after liberation, bringing desperately needed medical capacity. Even with trained personnel and proper supplies, mortality remained staggering. Approximately 1,000 prisoners died in the first week after liberation, despite intensive care. Their bodies too damaged to recover even when food, medicine, and compassion became available. Captain Benjamin Ference, a war crimes investigator who arrived days after liberation, documented the medical challenges. We had penicillin, sulfa drugs, plasma, whole blood, the best medical resources in the world. But you can't reverse years of starvation and disease in days or weeks. We saved thousands, but we lost hundreds who were beyond saving when we arrived. Every death felt like failure, even though we knew it wasn't. The systematic provision of care to surviving prisoners required organizational capabilities that demonstrated American logistical strengths. Within a week, Buchenwald had functioning mess facilities serving appropriate nutrition to recovering prisoners, hospital wards treating the sickest patients, delousing stations preventing disease spread, and administrative offices processing names and nationalities for eventual repatriation. The efficiency of American organization impressed surviving prisoners familiar with Nazi systems characterized by cruelty, but also by dysfunction and inefficiency. American personnel demonstrated that humanitarian care could be systematically delivered, that mercy could be organized as efficiently as violence had been. The confrontation with evil. As American forces secured camps and began understanding what they'd discovered, the response combined immediate humanitarian action with determination to document evidence for eventual prosecution. Eisenhower's orders mandated comprehensive photography, film recording, witness testimony collection, and preservation of physical evidence. Signal Corps photographers and cameramen documented camps in excruciating detail. The barracks, the crematoria, The piles of corpses, the walking skeletons of survivors, the instruments of torture and execution. The visual evidence created records that would prevent future denial of what Nazi Germany had constructed. The documentation extended beyond photography to forced witness. American commanders ordered German civilians from nearby towns to tour camps and confront what had existed in their proximity. Thousands of Germans who'd claimed ignorance were marched through Buchenwald, Dachau, and other camps to witness the results of systems they'd enabled through active participation or passive acceptance. The forced confrontations produced varied reactions. Some Germans wept. Others remained stoic. Many claimed they hadn't known the full extent of camp operations. American personnel showed little sympathy for claimed ignorance. The evidence was too overwhelming, the proximity too close, the willful blindness too convenient. Lieutenant Colonel William Cowling, whose battalion guarded Buchenwald during initial weeks, supervised civilian tours. We made the mayor and town council bury bodies, made them dig graves, carry corpses, conduct funerals. They complained it wasn't their fault, that they were only following orders or didn't know. I told them that not knowing required deliberate effort when the smoke from the crematoria was visible from their homes. They buried bodies. The individual transformations. For American soldiers who participated in camp liberations, the experience created psychological burdens and transformations that persisted throughout their lives. Combat veterans who'd fought across Europe described camp liberations as more disturbing than anything they'd experienced in battle. The liberators struggled with rage, helplessness, and moral reckoning. Rage at perpetrators of systematic atrocity. Helplessness at being unable to save everyone despite their best efforts. Moral reckoning about humanity's capacity for organized evil and what civilization meant if such systems could exist. Private Robert Persinger, who'd fought from Normandy to Buchenwald, wrote to his parents in late April 1945, "I thought I understood what we were fighting against. I was wrong. I understood military enemy, strategic objectives, tactical situations. I didn't understand evil until I walked through that camp. Now I know exactly why this war mattered and why we could never have accepted anything except unconditional surrender. Some things can't be negotiated with." The liberators also discovered unexpected reserves of compassion within themselves. Soldiers hardened by combat found themselves crying over prisoners they couldn't save, sharing personal supplies with strangers, staying up through nights sitting with dying men who just needed someone present in their final hours. Staff Sergeant James Murphy described his transformation. "Before Buchenwald, I was a soldier following orders and trying to survive. After Buchenwald, I understood I was part of something bigger, that we were fighting for basic human dignity against systems designed to destroy it. Every prisoner we saved justified the entire war. Every one we lost drove me to ensure this could never happen again." The long recovery. The immediate liberation was only the beginning of recovery processes that would take months or years for survivors whose bodies and minds bore wounds that medical treatment alone couldn't heal. The physical rehabilitation from starvation and disease proved challenging but achievable. The psychological recovery from systematic dehumanization took lifetimes. Displaced persons camps established by Allied authorities became temporary homes for tens of thousands of survivors who had no families or homes to return to. Jewish survivors particularly faced grim reality. Their communities had been destroyed, their families murdered, their home nations often still hostile to Jewish presence. American personnel staffing DP camps continued the humanitarian work that began with liberation. They provided not just food and shelter, but also assistance with family searches, emigration paperwork, vocational training, and psychological support. The commitment extended beyond military necessity into moral obligation. The survivors themselves exhibited extraordinary resilience. People who'd endured years of systematic destruction found strength to rebuild lives from nothing. They learned new languages, acquired new skills, built new families, and created and subsequent war crimes prosecutions. They educated generations about Holocaust realities and served as warning about where ideology unchecked by moral restraint could lead. The Final Testament. On April 11, 1995, the 50th anniversary of Buchenwald's liberation, elderly survivors gathered with elderly American veterans at the camp, now preserved as a memorial. Among them stood Israel Gutman, age 71, beside Marcus Klein, age 72, the prisoner who'd thought American gentleness meant his mind had broken, and the medic who'd made impossible triage decisions in liberation's first hours. "He saved my life," Gutman said simply, his hand on Klein's shoulder. "Not just physically. He and the others saved our humanity. We'd been treated as less than animals for so long that we'd started believing it. When Americans arrived and treated us as people worth saving, they gave us back ourselves." Klein, his voice rough with emotion, responded, "We just did what had to be done. We couldn't save everyone, and that knowledge still haunts me. But every person who survived, everyone who got to live a full life after that hell, that's why we fought the war. Not for territory or strategy, but so places like Buchenwald could never exist again." The liberation of Nazi concentration camps by American forces was never about glory or heroism in conventional military terms. It was about confronting the darkest capabilities of human civilization and responding with the best capabilities of human compassion. It was about soldiers who'd been trained for war, futures that concentration camps had tried to make impossible. The moral reckoning. The liberation of concentration camps forced American forces and American society to confront uncomfortable questions about knowledge, action, and moral responsibility. When had Allied intelligence known about camps? Could liberation have come sooner? Had military priorities delayed rescue of people dying while battles over strategic objectives continued? The questions had no satisfying answers. Allied intelligence had received reports about camps throughout the war, but had struggled to verify information or understand the systematic nature of Nazi genocide. Military strategy had prioritized defeating German armed forces rather than rushing to specific locations. The decision calculus that balanced military objectives against humanitarian rescue remained morally complex decades later. What remained clear was that when American forces reached camps, they responded with immediate and comprehensive humanitarian action, despite having no advance preparation, inadequate resources, and ongoing combat operations requiring their primary attention. The response wasn't perfect, but it was wholehearted. General Eisenhower's insistence on documentation and witness reflected understanding that liberation created moral obligation beyond immediate rescue. The world needed to see what had existed, needed undeniable evidence that would prevent future denial or minimization of Nazi crimes. The photographs, films, and testimonies collected during liberation became foundational evidence at Nuremberg trials, discovering their greatest mission was mercy. The prisoners who walked through opened gates couldn't believe American soldiers had come for them because they'd stopped believing anyone cared whether they lived or died. Their shock at liberation testified to how completely Nazi systems had tried to erase their humanity and their hope. But when American forces arrived, broke the locks, provided food and medicine, and treated skeletal strangers with dignity and care, they proved that mercy could transcend hatred, that humanity could be restored even in places designed to destroy it, and that the ultimate victory wasn't just defeating evil armies, but refusing to become evil in response to evil.